Now let's come to our second speaker for today, Radu. Radu Vaduva is a privacy, risk, and compliance technical architect from Microsoft. And Radu is a technical specialist focusing on compliance and helping customers with their digital transformation, specifically to Microsoft 365 service. Radu has over 25 years IT experience, and he held both consulting and sales roles. And he has worked for Microsoft Services, Microsoft Technology Center, and most recently, the Microsoft Canada Specialist Team Unit. And Radu will talk about data protection and privacy, protecting a human right.
Excellent. All right. Thanks for the introduction, Brian. Good evening, everyone. So tonight, what I would like to do with 25 minutes is give you an understanding of how Microsoft looks at data protection and privacy, and really from an angle of what we see in the industry, what we see with customers we deal with, and what is the direction even from our leadership team that we're pointed down towards when it comes to this important aspect of technology, which is really predominantly focusing on privacy. And by the way, welcome to Data Privacy Week in Canada. This is, I believe, the second annual week where there is a lot of focus put on privacy, especially with some of the newer regulations and discussions that come up around this topic. And it is something that's very near and dear to my heart, as well as to Microsoft, as you'll see here in a moment as I go through my presentation. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll start with, I think everyone is familiar with our CEO and president from a Microsoft Corp perspective, Satya Nadella. And I'll start with what he calls a trusted business. And this is the direction or what we all keep in mind, from our engineering teams all the way to the leadership team, to the sales and the technical specialists or technical architects, so the sales marketing people we work with, as well as any time we engage with business partners, with contractors, and with customers to have discussions around technology and leveraging both Microsoft and Microsoft partner technology. And really, it's all about the digital experiences that are being created. So a digital experience is really, think about it as any type of either a specific product or a solution that's put together for specific purposes. Could be customer relationship management or a CRM system. Could be something as simple as deploying a SharePoint online site for OneDrive for business, repositories for organizations, and how we enable that in order to treat the human right, the privacy, as a core human right. And what that really means is how, as a human, you have the control over the data that an employer, an organization you work with, or any type of organization you're engaged with, whether it would be a retailer, like any of the grocery stores you shop at, and the information they collect about you, how it's being used, and your right to access that information and have it protected, and trusting that the organizations you're giving this information to is actually looking after your best interest and keeping that in place. From an agenda perspective, I'm just going to quickly go through the data protection and data privacy There is a lot of information that exists around the data protection principles and the pillars, and also around privacy. In terms of keeping myself on time here, just want to make sure that I highlight a couple of key areas, and definitely welcome any of the questions that come about, and I'll check them in the in the chat. From a data protection principle, so just in general, it's really when you think about how an organization looks at it, and these are generic. So, and I'll draw some examples, like more practical examples when it comes to technology, but it's really allowing the use of a set of capabilities to establish some standards or recommended practices to secure your data. So one example of that I can give you, and going along with what Dan was talking about in terms of the DLP and the overall data discovery and understanding what exists within an environment, it's really to implement, for example, a data classification. So identifying every single communication or piece of content or piece of data that exists within an organization, to be described about what is that data used for, how is it protected, what is the process that the organization has implemented, and also how the organization expects you as an employee to deal with it. And there's really the foundation for data protection looks at how the personal data should be protected depending on the context, data type, and the purpose of the data. You could have purpose of data for marketing purposes, where obviously from a consent perspective, you have to receive that from the person you're marketing to, or you can have purpose of data where it gets leveraged in creating some type of artificial intelligence or machine learning project like ChatGPT, and having those capabilities or that data exposed through those AI or machine learning projects. It also allows an organization to respond to any security incidents that result from a data breach. And there's a couple of engineers at Microsoft who, we have internal training and events that we attend, and one of them is very passionate about the fact that data on its own doesn't possess a risk to an organization. What possesses a risk to an organization is a user, an employee, someone touching that data. Because if you think about it, the way attacks tend to take place, those attacks enter through the lens of an end user. An end user goes and does something. They click on a link in an email or in Facebook, to follow Dan's example. They actually give someone their password or their account information. And they'll even go to the step of giving them the 6-digit text message that they get, or 6-digit PIN that they get as a second factor authentication in text messages. So that's always in the back of your mind. You should always have, and even following the zero trust model, which is something that Microsoft builds kind of solutions around, is the fact that security incidents will or could possibly happen at any given time within an organization's lifetime. So related to that data breach, how do you respond to the security incidents? It's very important to have that process in place and have the data protection principles and the pillars, the capabilities that you should have as an organization implemented. And then the last but not least is, how do you control data access and minimize the data footprint in order to de-risk? And de-risk may not be the right to use here, but really to mitigate the risk or minimize the risk. You're always going to have a risk. going back to kind of risk management 101, low, medium, high, you're always going to have some risk, and you need to, it's all about mitigating risk. Is not saying we have zero risks within an organization. There is no such thing. So that's very important from a data protection principles to understand. Now, as we go next and look at the pillars, so think about these as the components of data protection. And when you look at data protection, look at it as a program rather than um, rather than something that you run through once and that's it. It basically set it and forget it. There's no such thing when it comes to data protection and data privacy, because no one, no risk ever stops or again is completely eliminated based on my previous slide. So what are the data protection pillars? And I'm going to choose a couple of them just in the interest of time from this list. You can use this list and do your research in terms of these are the pillars and what types of processes, technologies, governance, support you have, and even the groups that you put together, employee groups within the organization to have these implemented. We typically look at, in organizations will look at data protection at rest and in transit, right? That's always the question. How do you protect a piece of data? And when I say piece of data, again, I'm referring to any type of chat, instant message, email, document, PDF file, row of data in a database that supports a line of business application. It's all of that, and that's what I mean by piece of data. How do you protect it at rest and in transit? And more importantly, the topics that typically come up around data protection are around encryption, and Microsoft and other vendors in the industry have their own capabilities of encrypting data at rest and in transit. They are always evolving because the attackers are always evolving and you always want to protect against them. Pseudonymization and anonymization of data is also very important when you look at data protection. So those are all, they're not mutually exclusive. They're all typically used as part of this pillar around data protection at rest and in transit. Data minimization, retention, which is again very important from any kind of regulation or industry standard that exists out there. Access controls, and when you think about access controls, don't think about access controls just from I'm an employee within an organization, what type of access do I have to the data? Think about also I'm an employee within an organization that works with data that's collected both for adults as well as, for example, minors, children. So children information, health information, for example, for children going into a clinic or going into the hospital. When you think about that data access control, you as an employee, you will have access to the information based on the fact that the adult has signed off on his or her own information to be used in certain scenarios, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their child follows the same process, because from a data access control perspective, you have a consent that you have to abide by to access that information. So it's very important to think about all of the aspects of these pillars as you kind of peel back the layers. Data classification, again, very important from all organization points of view. And then what the impact assessments or impact reviews that you'll find come along with every single regulation. And typically the regulations will have a way of presenting to an organization what they have to adhere to and the controls, and then the organizations have to understand what the impact is to their business from all of these regulations that they have to adhere to. The impact reviews or assessments are a necessity for any regulatory department, so any compliance, legal, privacy department within organizations, because that's how they track how well they're doing, not just against the regulation, but how well they're doing to protect the data and ultimately the privacy of their both employees as well as customers and business partners. And then anything around vendor management, third parties, so your the contractors hired within the organizations and so on and so forth. Now, again, I'm going to only focus in on a couple of pillars in the interest of time from that list, and just walk you through a few of them that I thought would be interesting to call out. First, the first one I'll talk about is data minimization. So data minimization really is the concept of, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating this for any of you who are familiar with what that means to an organization, is really minimizing the amount of data, specifically personal data, that's collecting, and the essential amount or the necessary amount of that data that's needed by the applications or the business. And typically the rule of thumb is the less data stored, the lower the risk or impact. So always keep that in mind from a data minimization perspective. The review implementation gives you the ability to understand active personal data storage locations. So the concept of discovering and understanding what type of data you have within the organization is very much front and center from this point of view. And then it's usually applicable, the data minimization pillar is usually applicable throughout the data lifecycle. So when you work, so, and this is an example that would be specific to a custom application that's developed by your organization and implemented. Whenever, or it can be expanded to any other off-the-shelf product. But whenever you look at data minimization, it actually has to impact every single environment that you're going to test that solution in a proof of concept, in a proof of value, any kind of testing that you're doing from a development perspective, from production, and then even elevating that to understanding analytics or business intelligence around the use of that application. Okay, so keep that in mind from a data minimization perspective. Data minimization processes, they usually look at, review the personal data collected. I'm not going to read the slide to you, and again, you'll have the recording, but it's really important to understand from an app development perspective, whether it's a new application or an enhancement that you're introducing into an application. Same goes again for off-the-shelf products, is identify the purpose of the data collected, validate that, so audit for active personal data in non-production systems, validate the data is protected with using encryption, pseudonymization, anonymization, and then flag or remove any personal data that is not compliant based on the compliance checks that you have as an organization. And then when you look at the production, the BI and the analytics side of it, it's really important to conduct design reviews for both the analytics to understand the current, it provides the appropriate business context, but then also that the data collection is valid from that point of view. And I'm going to let this slide build out, but really this shows kind of the key elements when you look at data minimization. So you have the application, and again, could be custom, could be something that was developed for you by an external vendor, or it could be off the shelf. The business purpose, personal data fields collected, the data collection type. So is it upstream, downstream? Is there any caching of that happens on devices? Because again, it identifies a risk there. And then any business justification if there is there isn't any, then obviously you need to eliminate or remove that personal data, and then obviously dealing with any exceptions that exist. Okay, so that's data minimization. Now, the second pillar that I wanted to focus on from that list is data access. And data access is really focusing specifically around this concept of entitlements and role-based access control. And also the concept of just-in-time or JIT elevation, where I think we've talked about this in the industry, and every single solution or piece of software that we come across will definitely look at is there role-based access control? Is there a way where I can remove the need for someone to have a standing access to content or an application and really do that on demand, specific to the job required, a requirement or the access to the data with just in time. So how do you manage memberships, elevate members, and then have the process leveraged for all of the environments? Again, going back to data minimization and how you walk through all of those environments, it is important that this is not just available in production, because you will have exposure in pre-production environments, whether it's user acceptance testing or UAT environments or dev environments. It doesn't really matter. And this is the point that I made earlier around why data access controls and the fact that when you think about it, permissions to data storage and access to personal data is one aspect, but then what permissions are need to be acquired to continue access, and is it something that's required ongoing, or can you implement just in time? And then specifically to consent. So how does that collection or the personal data that you're accessing work in the real world, where you have, again, from a human right perspective, you have, let's call it the hierarchy of access to that data that needs to be vetted by specific people within your environment. Fraud control detection. So these are just additional consideration for when it comes to data access control. Auditing for personal data access without the business purpose, and this is something that we continue to do within the Microsoft solution side, but also see it across the industry, where we keep looking for why do you need access to this information? So the classification of the data, then why as an employee you need access to it, track it, and then is this the absolute minimum amount of information that we're going to expose that's required by an employee? So that's the data protection side. On the data privacy side, and this is something that again, it requires a further or a lot larger discussion, and we definitely have an expert coming up on the panel who's deeper has deeper knowledge in privacy than I probably do. But think about data privacy as going above and beyond just the regulations, and the regulations always change, and it really gets split between personal data and appropriateness of processing based on laws and regulations, individual expectations, and also customer agreements, right? Those are the agreements that you get whenever you sign up for an event, for example, right? And those agreements are very important when it comes to privacy, because a lot of regulations ask organizations to keep track of that. One example I'll give you, when GDPR was implemented, or when it came about in the EU, Microsoft decided as a corporation for all of the employees around the world, not just the EU-based ones, to actually implement in our CRM system, which runs on Dynamics, to implement very strict controls over what accounts and customer contacts I can see based on where I work. So I'm part of a community inside Microsoft, and we always help each other out. So I'll have people from Europe, from countries in Europe, from countries in Asia reach out to me to ask questions, and then I need to get a bit of more information about the customer. Today, the only way I can do that based on this implementation is to actually ask the employee, and the employee who's in that region knows the rules about exposing just the right amount of information for the purpose of me presenting a solution back to his or her customer. Where in the past, before GDPR, I could actually go into a system and look that up. Or we implemented processes where I have to be assigned to a specific opportunity for me to see that kind of information. And again, it is driven by the fact that there is a purpose for me to look into this information. I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to quickly go through this. Privacy usually is something that we build into our processes and tools by design. There's data stewardship, so ownership, the responsibility of protecting personal data, know the business need and benefit, practice again data minimization. So you see a lot of alignment with data protection, and then also be accountable for compliance. And this is specific to the company, not necessarily that we expect every single employee within an organization to understand the regulations that the company lines up to. And then responsible use, transparency, and user control. And I know I'm out of time, Brian, so I'm just going to build this out. From a Microsoft perspective, and this is the only kind of sort of product and marketing slide I'll put out there. We do have capabilities built for the cloud services that we build to go through and look after identity. Again, keeping in mind the fact that data doesn't expose itself. It's usually a user who takes an action. There's defense around attacks and stopping personal data breaches, information protection or data protection, and governance, as well as privacy management. So with that, I'm going to stop my presentation and see if there's any questions, or if we want to just go directly to the panel.